How is everyone? Good, excellent. You're able to hear me. That is fantastic. I'm absolutely excited to be back here at the North Andover Historical Society. I presented, I think it was in March or April, where I was talking about the Minutemen of the Merrimack Valley with an emphasis on the towns of Andover. One of the central pieces of that particular presentation was Colonel James Frye of Andover. And when the North Andover Historical Society asked me to come back and speak again about Colonel James Frye and his importance to the Merrimack Valley, and more importantly, his importance relative to the American Revolutionary cause, I said absolutely, positively yes. Growing up, I was aware of James Frye. I grew up in North Andover on Herrick Road, and I was aware of James Frye, but I really didn't appreciate him more until probably around the 225th celebration of the battles of Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill. About a year ago, I was a historical consultant to the 250th anniversary planning for the Battle of Bunker Hill. And it consisted of representatives of the city of Gloucester, because you can't do the Battle of Bunker Hill reenactment up in Charlestown because there's no room. There was various civic organizations involved, very historical organizations involved, and they had asked me to come in to serve as the historian to provide consultation for this event. And when I had my first or second meeting, I said, all right, well, let's see what you have for, or what do you intend to have for various regiments that we're going to portray on the American side for this important 250th reenactment. And they were all very excited. They said, we have Stark. And I said, of course you have Stark. That's the New Hampshire men. Most of the men were from Rockingham County. That is absolutely fantastic. We have Prescott. I was like, all right, great, Prescott. Prescott is probably one of the most well-known figures of the battle. And then they rattled off a few artillery commanders, and that was it. And I kind of paused for a second, and I said, well, what about Frye's battalion? And I got kind of a pause, and I said, you need to understand, I said, the Battle of Bunker Hill, I said, the unique thing about Battle of Bunker Hill is all three regiments, which we'll talk about tonight, that were inside that redoubt fighting for their lives, were all from the Merrimack Valley. And I said, you cannot have the Battle of Bunker Hill without representing Colonel James Frye's regiment. Took a little twisting of arms, took a little bit, but I was happy to say that at the 250th battle reenactment of Bunker Hill this past June, Colonel Frye's regiment was represented by over 150 men and women from around the United States. That's me in the blue up front. I insisted in exchange for my historical consultation that I would get to play Colonel James Frye. And so, rest assured, Stark and Prescott kind of overshadowed me, but that's not the point. I wanted to make sure that the men of the Merrimack Valley were represented at this reenactment. And of the 158, one of the companies represented Amesbury, one of the companies represented Methuen, and the largest company within Frye's regiment for this reenactment represented Andover. That was the other thing I wanted to make sure also. So what are we going to talk about tonight? For a little bit of introduction, Colonel James Frye played a very pivotal and important role in both 18th century Massachusetts politics as well as the Revolutionary War movement. As a commander of the Minuteman Battalion, composed of local farmers and yeomen, from the Merrimack Valley, Frye transformed these individuals into a fighting unit where they were determined to absolutely positively defend their English liberties and, more importantly, defend the Merrimack Valley. In both his life as well as legacy, Colonel James Frye embodied the essence of the citizen soldier. It was his belief and his approach that English liberties, as well as rising up to support the common cause, were a central tenet in his life. And as a result, when the call came to rise up against the crown, he was an individual who recognized that it was important for him to stand up for English liberties and to permanently link North Andover and Andover to the revolutionary movement. So what we are going to discuss tonight, first of all, I will go over the early life of James Frye. I will discuss how he was a soldier in His Majesty's service. and that would be James Frye in the French Wars. We will talk about the early wars when he was a teenager, his role in Louisburg during King George's War, and then ultimately the French and Indian War. I will give an overview of the political crises of the 1760s as well as the 1770s. I do want to talk about the prelude to war, before Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. I will talk about how the town of Andover, as well as James Frye, prepared their communities for warfare. I will discuss the Lexington Alarm and briefly this little-known battle that is known as the Battle of Chelsea Creek. I will get into the Battle of Bunker Hill and the critical role that James Frye played in this particular battle. I will talk about the aftermath of the Battle of Bunker Hill and the final months of James Frye, what happened to him after that particular fight. And as I always tell my guests when I give my lectures, if you behave yourselves, and if you're good, I will let you ask questions at the end. And I, of course, have to be on my best behavior because seated in the front row is my old third grade teacher, Mrs. Gessing. I think I owe her detention. I'm not sure. And if you have any complaints about my lecture, my father is over about that way somewhere. You're more than welcome to harass him also. But for those who have attended my lectures in the past, I always start off with an inspirational quote. I always like to get everyone in the mood, get excited about this particular lecture, and inspire people. And I thought, recently, as part of work, I claim I'm taking business classes, which really means I'm watching The Office. So I figured it was appropriate to start off with a good quote from Michael Scott. Okay, tough crowd. All right. So let us start off with, I'd like to start off with the early life and family of James Frye, because there's a lot of confusion about the Fryes. Growing up, I was under the mistaken belief that James Frye was the son of Joseph Frye, or they were brothers or stuff. There's a lot of Fryes in the area, and it takes a little just to navigate through the particular families. So starting off, James Frye III was born on January 24th, 1710. Ironically, 3 days before me. There's some debate about where he was born. Some historians have said he was in Andover when he was born. Other genealogists have said, well, we think he might have been in Methuen. From the documentation I've seen and been able to dig through a little bit of reports and church records, it appears that he was actually in Bradford, Massachusetts when he was born. Oops, what just happened there? So sorry, people.
Bradford like April?
There we go. Oh, you got it. I got it. Just my fat fingers moving. James' parents were Captain James Frye II and his wife Joanna Sprague of Malden, Massachusetts. He was the second generation American within the Frye family on both sides, both the Fryes and the Spragues. Both his sets of grandparents arrived in Massachusetts in the middle of the 17th century. His parents, after marriage, had initially settled in Andover, Massachusetts, but appears they relocated to Bradford approximately 1709 to expand upon their farm holdings. So they held property in Andover, Massachusetts, as well as Bradford, Massachusetts. James had 4 siblings and was the second oldest. Of the 5 children total, 3 were girls, Joanna, Sarah, and Phoebe, and 2 were boys, James and John. It appears John, he sort of disappears from historical records, so I strongly suspect he either died in infancy or shortly after childbirth. And sadly, Joanna, James's mother, died approximately in 1715 after giving birth to her youngest daughter, Phoebe. Well, if we look at his early life, James' father, which is kind of, I guess, early 18th century scandal, James' father, James II, remarried approximately 11 months after Joanna had passed away in December of 1715 to a Joanna Atwood. The second marriage produced one more child, a half-sister to James, which was Rachel. And at some point after Rachel's birth, the family returned back to Andover, Massachusetts. Now, after James returned, James II returned to Andover, roughly around about 1715, 1716. He was a yeoman or a farmer by trade. He had other trades that he was engaged in as well, but his primary occupation was farming. So as such, he began to till his fields, work his fields, and what he did was, is at some point, he would have made a decision to start training James III, our Colonel James Frye, in how to be a yeoman, and he would have been trained in the various skills necessary. So this particular graph that I put together is essentially what activities would have taken place during the seasons on an 18th century New England farm that James, as we're about to see, would have been trained as a young man as well as a teenager. December to March in Andover, they would have been working on tilling their gardens and plowing their tillage fields, gathering winter wood and manure, ice harvesting, and slaughtering hogs and other animals. April to June is where you're getting ready to start the farming season. You're plowing fields, milking cows, engaging in cheese making, soap making, as well as maintenance around the house. During the summer, July to August, is when you're going to be starting harvesting. Hay and grain harvesting, laundry and household cleaning, which is some of the chores that the female aspects of a household would have had, as well as cooking extra meals for any hands. Then spring to November, September to November is the big time where you're actually out in the fields bringing everything in. And this is what some of the activities that our future Colonel James Frye would have been engaged in. And of course, as we take a look at that, if we have to first break down the definition of what a colonial child's life was like, infancy is defined as anything from birth up to age 7. Childhood is from age 7 to roughly about 13 or 14. During this particular stage, youth are introduced to education as well as religious instruction and physical labor. From roughly about 14 through age 21, this is where you start seeing in Andover boys and girls being separated out by gender and then being given gender-specific roles in this particular time. This is also the time that many documentation that I've seen throughout the 18th century, teenagers today were just like teenagers in the 18th century. They're a pain in everybody's butt. Okay, they're sneaking out to the woods drinking. They're sneaking out and partying. The ministers are all horrified at their behavior, and they're trying to keep these teenagers busy by assigning them various responsibilities. Usually what you would see that boys around 14 would start to determine, are you going to be working as a yeoman or a farmer, or are we going to start putting you towards a particular skilled trade? A father at this particular point would be either steering them towards yeomanship, or if they felt it would be better productive and more profitable, they would steer them towards some form of an apprenticeship. You would also see girls during this time would start being instructed on housekeeping and worked how to assemble and work with household textiles that they would need throughout their future lives. Girls could marry by age of 16, and by 16 also boys were expected to serve in the militia, as we're going to be talking about in a few minutes. Entry into adulthood, by the time usually they hit 21, both boys and girls, or young men and women, are considered legally adults, although they may be still dependent upon their parents. And as a result, they may be staying within the household, they may be relocating relatively closely nearby, and they could be hoping that they would receive either some form of a land inheritance or a financial inheritance from a parent so that they could move to another location. And when you take a look at some of the chores that James Frye would have had growing up within Andover, first of all, during the infancy stages, again, he would have been instructed to early education as well as religious instruction. By age 10, he's pretty much assisting around the farm with his sisters. So he would be doing generally chores, fetching firewood, maybe chopping wood, assisting carrying tools, helping his mother clean up the particular household. You would see generally around this time, younger siblings would be also responsible for feeding livestock as well as animals on the property. By the time of harvest comes around, they are collecting and providing food for various workers in the field, helping sheathe or collect any cut down grain, and they're also assisting in husking and preparing of any food. During the autumn, they could also be called upon to assist in cider making, boiling apples for sauce, or putting up vegetables. And again, you see this during their up to about 14. In the winter, again, they could be recruited to muck out the stalls, clean out the outhouse, carry wood, or gather kindling. And in the spring, again, they'd be responsible. No wonder the teenagers were so cranky. They'd be responsible for spreading the dung throughout the fields for fertilization. And then as the year would be called upon, again, usual year-round activities, fetching water, tending to the fireplace, and assist around the house. But again, by the time they are 11 to 14, they're starting to slowly switch over to that segregated responsibilities. And so what we see here is with James Frye, boys were responsible for particularly farming. There's actually an 18th century journal from Essex County that looks into the stages of progression for a young man, roughly about 14, working his way to about 18, what he would be doing on the farm. So by about age 11, he's spreading flax and clearing stalls, as we discussed. Age 12, he's learning how to hoe. So James Frye, roughly around 12, would have been taught how to hoe. By 13, he's doing the carting and spreading of dung, so he's learning how to fertilize the field. By age 14, he's digging stones and digging trenches throughout the fields. Age 17, he is up to sawing wood and may be introduced to various carpentry skills as well. And by age 18, he's managing a team of oxen. So you can see this is the progression that James would have gone through as he was growing up in North Andover, well, then Andover, North Parish, where he would be learning these various skills as he progressed in age. Well, what you see, oh, that's what I'm doing wrong, is once he becomes 21, he marries 21-year-old Elizabeth Osgood. So James was 24, she was 21. She is part of the Osgood family, one of the most established families here in Andover. Within a year, the couple would have their first child, a girl named Elizabeth. And between 1755 and 1752, Elizabeth, the mom, would deliver no less than 8 children, 2 boys and 6 girls. Whew. Studies have shown that most colonial New England couples, the wife was generally pregnant most of her life up until about 40, 42. So, oh boy. I should also mention, you may notice that the wife, Elizabeth, named the oldest Elizabeth. It was very common in the 18th century not to just name boys after the fathers. They would often name daughters after the mother as well. By 1745, Elizabeth and James are starting to establish themselves within Andover, Massachusetts as a political and economic powerhouse within the community. And over the next 15 years, James would firmly establish himself as being one of the leading figures within the North Parish of Andover. He would open a tavern at his residence, which is presently Chestnut Street. He expanded his farm holdings, which we'll discuss a little bit later. He owned and operated a local ironworks. So the famous Saugus Ironworks were not the only local ironworks in Essex County. There was an ironworks here in Andover, Massachusetts as well. And he held political office as well. Now, one thing we do have to discuss, for everybody, the 18th century, there is no perfect person. And in this particular case, the Frye family, as well as the Osgood family by marriage, were no strangers to enslaved peoples here in Andover. Both James Frye III and his wife Elizabeth were quite familiar with slavery. The Frye family and the Osgood family prior to this marriage, according to historical records, were involved and did own enslaved people. It appears that James' father owned a enslaved person named Peter. And according to local church records, he was baptized here in an Andover church in 1727. Colonel Frye is believed to have owned at least 2 enslaved people during his lifetime. One individual pops up in a Essex County Gazette newspaper advertisement in 1770, where James Frye announces, and the transcription is there on the left. James Frye announces that he is closing up, or he's getting away from the ironwork business, and as a result, he's scaling back on his expenses. And he's basically saying, I'm looking to sell this enslaved person to cut back on costs. So that advertisement appeared on April 9th, 1770. There's also a second, what we believe to be an enslaved person or recently freed, who's identified as Caesar Frye. And he serves as the colonel's quote-unquote Negro servant, and would have performed during the siege of Boston various duties as a waiter and valet. I went through in preparation for this lecture various muster rolls as well as historical records. Caesar Frye does not have any military service as far as I can see, but it does appear that he served as a waiter and a valet to various officers, ultimately gaining his, if he was enslaved, he gained his freedom in 1780 and was still alive in this area in the early 19th century. As they continue on with the Frye family, by December of 1756, sadly, Elizabeth passed. 5 months later, he remarries. Something about the Fryes. They married very, very quickly. He married a 34-year-old widow from Lynn, Massachusetts, named Sarah Cheever Roby. And it was interesting when I saw the name Sarah Cheever Roby because it's very uncommon to see 2 last names. And as I did some more digging, it does appear that Sarah Cheever Roby was previously married. She was a widow herself. So as a result, there were various stepchildren that came into the Frye family. James and Sarah had 3 more children, 2 girls and a boy. And after the death of Elizabeth, Frye continued to push his economic standing, and it continued to grow. And by this late 1750s, he is attempting to gobble up and purchase as many tracts of land up in the Maine province. He's particularly eyeing York County as an opportunity to acquire various lands, and he's also looking to expand business ventures as well. There are some hints, although I can't corroborate it, that he was approached to possibly invest in some various ships in the Newburyport and Salem areas. It's hints, I have yet to corroborate it. But he is looking at this particular point to expand his holdings even greater. Well, the problem for James Frye and for many of the residents in Andover up to the 1763 is life is not always stable. There is this always continuous threat that is seeking to potentially disrupt success, family stability, and livelihoods. And what that was the French. We need to understand that when James Frye, Colonel James Frye, our James Frye, was born, the Merrimack Valley was still considered frontier territory of Massachusetts Bay Colony, and as a result was under constant threat of British raids and attack from the north in Canada, as well as coming down through New Hampshire and from parts of the Maine province. And so when we look at James Frye's military service, this is not a person who simply just sprung up one day and said, I'm going to fight the British, and I'm going to kick their butts, and I'm going to win. This is a man who developed military skills over the years, first with militia service and eventually working his way through various wars with the French. And it will make sense as we're going along why this man was chosen for the important role that he did. When he was born in 1710, New England was in the middle of a very brutal military conflict. known as Queen Anne's War. Queen Anne's War was part of the it was part of the war that was known as the War of Spanish Succession. Queen Anne's War was the North American theater of this particular war. This was a fight over French, Spanish, and British holdings, where basically it is the French and the Spanish versus the British, as well as all their Native American allies, and it dragged in all the colonists as well. So this was essentially a world war that was taking place. During Queen Anne's War, New England was constantly subjected to deadly raids by French milice, French soldiers, and Native American allies. Between 1703 and 1713, there were more than a dozen military raids into the Merrimack Valley, into southern New Hampshire and York County, Maine, many of which involved the slaughter of civilians. And it's likely that by an early age, James is hearing about this. None of these raids reached Andover, but you had accounts of raids going into Amesbury, accounts of raids in Wells, Maine, accounts taking place in Dover, taking place outside of what is now Portsmouth, New Hampshire, taking place near Haverhill. These are all raids that are taking place right on James' family doorstep. And so growing up, he was probably very keenly aware of this particular French threat. From what we can determine, when James III turned 16 years of age, he would have enlisted in the town's militia company. He would have been required by Massachusetts colonial law to field as a militiaman. Under colonial service, he would have been required to supply his own arms and equipment, which you're going to see an example by law in just a second what he was required to supply himself with. And if he couldn't afford it, or if he was unable to afford it, then the community of Andover would have had to pool money together to loan him the various equipment. According to one particular example from a militia law that came out roughly about 1728, 1730, so this is around the time that James is serving in the militia, he would have been required, first of all, to field with a musket, which is referred to as a firelock. He would have been required also to field with a cartouche box or a shot pouch, which would carry his ammunition. He would have to carry 1 pound of powder, most likely in a horn. He would also have to have an additional 20 bullets fit to his gun. He would have to have extra flints so that the musket could fire the ammunition that was loaded into the gun. He was required to have a sword or a cutlass, a worm and priming wire, which are tools used to repair the musket, fit for his gun as well. And at least 4 times a year, he would have to appear on a local town common where his militia commander would actually inspect him to ensure that he is complying with law. If he was not complying with law, he would either be subject to a fine or he would be subject to corporal punishment as a result of his disobedience. There are no records that he actually did that. At this particular time, by the time he reaches militia age, Dummer's War, which is taking place with the Wabanaki Confederacy out of Maine, is taking place. This is a local conflict. This is not part of a greater French-British war. And it's winding down. So we estimate that James probably entered into militia service probably about 1725, 1726. So he's coming in at the tail end of the Dummer's War with the Wabanaki Council. It's possible many of the residents, because Merrimack Valley, Methuen, Andover, Amesbury, were all on the frontier at this particular time. Many of the houses have what were called garrison houses or garrison forts or fort houses, where if there was a raid, the locals would retreat into that particular house, and it would become a fortification that the militia would defend. And you would see militia companies rotate, like you may see Andover men dispatched to Amesbury, Amesbury dispatched over to Haverhill, just to give the communities a little bit of relief from this constant threat. It's possible that he may have served in a fort house somewhere in the Merrimack Valley. It's possible he may have been out on patrol along the Merrimack River to look for potential threats. Unfortunately, no records exist. But he was in the militia at this particular time. Well, jump forward to roughly the 1740s. We are now dealing with another French war. This particular French war is known as King George's War. And it's basically, again, it's referred to as the War of Austrian Succession, in which basically the British and the French are once again fighting over commercial trade routes. They're fighting over who's going to ascend various thrones and trying to establish political superiority. It is a 4-year war that is taking place in this region. King George's War is the nickname for the North American theater of this particular war. And again, you are starting to see raids. Even though the Merrimack Valley is no longer the real frontier of the Massachusetts colony, there's still threats of potential French raids taking place. And in early 1745, Massachusetts legislatures start turning their attention to a region of up near Nova Scotia that's referred to as Cape Breton. And sitting on Cape Breton is a massive fortification that is known as the Gibraltar of the North, Fortress Louisbourg. Fortress Louisbourg, in the mindset of New Englanders at this time, is a very, very serious threat. This is a major military station that the British can launch multiple attacks, whether by sea or land, towards New England. And Louisbourg is vital for the French because it's essentially protecting the Gulf of St. Lawrence, as well as the fisheries of the Grand Banks. So as a result, keep in mind, New Englanders and Canadian French are fighting over fishing grounds. That is one of the major reasons, besides religion, why there are colonial wars breaking out. It's because of overfisheries. Well, what essentially happens is the fort and its garrison, because they posed a direct threat, Massachusetts colonial legislature, in the middle of King George's War, the War of Austrian Succession, says, what are we going to do about this particular fort? Something must be done. Well, as luck would have it, they start getting reports in late 1744, early 1745, hey, this fortification is not as tough as you think it is. From the ocean side, facing out towards the water, very, very impregnable. You cannot break it. But around the back, it's not really well defended. And by the way, the garrison's pretty upset. They're poorly supplied and not well fed, and morale is really bad. So now New England is starting to say, hey, maybe we might want to attack Fortress Louisbourg. And what they could do is they could do it through siege warfare. Siege warfare is where it's a gradual bombardment of the fortifications, forcing eventually for them to surrender. Well, by May of 1745, New England is all in. The colonial legislature authorized the attack of Fortress Louisbourg. They said, based upon the spy reports that we're receiving, that the fortification is very weak from the rear, that the garrison is poorly supplied, we are going to attack this particular fortification. And what approximately comes is you have roughly 4,000 New England troops, most of them from the Maine province, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. You also have a British naval squadron of roughly 90 vessels, transport vessels as well as warships. So this is a joint provincial and British Royal Navy attack. Well, the siege took place from roughly May 12th to June 28th. The New England forces, as well as supported by the British forces, quickly set up a siege line. You can see William Pepperell essentially landed roughly about 10 miles north of Fortress Louisbourg and basically marched his way to the rear while the British are basically attacking the harbor. Colonial troops easily captured outlying forts outside of this fortification, including what is known as the Royal Battery, which was one of France's strongest artillery placements as part of the siege of Louisbourg Battery. They then promptly turned all the guns against the French garrison and just started firing their own guns against the French. British naval forces, as I mentioned, blockaded the harbor, cutting off any opportunity for supplies to come in. So now Fortress Louisbourg, its troops, as well as the civilians, because I should mention, Fortress Louisbourg is a massive fortification, but there's also a civilian town of Louisbourg that's inside the fortification as well. So you also have civilians that are trapped inside this fortification. Well, after about 6 weeks of siege operations, the French surrendered. New Englanders at the battlefield, as well as back home in Boston, are absolutely ecstatic. To the New England mindset, because this is relevant for the Battle of Bunker Hill, to the New England mindset, this victory is the equivalent in their mind of D-Day during World War II with European theater operations. They consider this a massive, massive military victory, and they basically say 2 reasons we won Louisburg. Number 1, through God's divine intervention. We are, God's New England. We are taking Louisburg. And secondly, just like Patriots fans today, we are New England, we kick everybody's butt. And that was the mindset that they felt, that we are this massive military power. And they felt that by taking this fortification, that placed them on the international level with France and England and Spain, that they should be seen as equals. Well, all good things must come to an end. Because after King George's War ended, under the terms of the 1748 Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, the fortress was returned to France. New Englanders were absolutely, positively disgusted. This really set into motion this feeling of betrayal by the crown. Our homeland, England, our mother country, stabbed us in the back. And that's what you see in a lot of the writings. And this is actually the earliest you start seeing the revolutionary movement of the American Revolution. This is the earliest stage that you start seeing dissatisfaction with England. And of course, quick sharing, here is a existing broadside that came out in 1745, just to highlight, celebrating New England's capture of Louisburg. It is a very long poem. I will share this slide deck with the Historical Society if you want to read it. You can actually also visit the online database of the Massachusetts Historical Society. They will share information also on the background of this particular broadside. And this is during the time before England took the fort away from them. Well, where is James Frye during all this stuff? Because if you had read the advertisement for this lecture, or if you know anything about James Frye, it's always referencing that James Frye was at Louisburg. James Frye hung out with George Washington at Louisburg. These 2 guys were buddies the entire way. Well, 90% of it is true. I do want to say one thing. I always say, don't believe Wikipedia. Please never read Wikipedia. In Wikipedia and some other 20th century documents I've seen, there's this statement that James Frye was good friends with George Washington at the Siege of Louisburg. They hung out, best of buddies, and this is why George Washington was so supportive of him during the Siege of Boston. They never met because George Washington was never at the Siege of Louisburg. But James Frye was. The way New England troops are raised for military campaigns, your militia companies are your home guard. Every male resident of Andover between 16 and 60 was required to serve in your militia. The primary purpose initially was a home guard in case of emergency, in case the French or natives attack. The secondary purpose was militias served as recruiting pools. So if we are going to do an expedition against Louisburg, a recruiting officer is going to show up, the Andover militias will muster, and then they'll try and draw recruits who will be paid for their services going up to Louisburg. Well, inherent within that recruiting system, it's also a little bit pyramid schemy. You would have a colonel who would have a commission. The colonel would then turn to a lieutenant colonel and say, listen, you can get this lieutenant colonelcy if you can raise 500 troops. And then the lieutenant colonel would then go and find 8 captains and say, you guys will each get captains if you can each raise 50 people for me. And then the captain would turn around and say to 2 guys, you 2 will be my lieutenants if you can each get 25 for me. And then it keeps going down there. Fred Anderson, in his book, A People's Army, which describes King George's War and the French and Indian War, this is how you recruit in New England. It's kind of an effective pyramid scheme. And James Frye, as a result of this, was recruited and volunteered for the expedition to Louisburg. We believe, at least I believe, he was part of Captain James Stevens' company of Colonel Robert Hale's 5th Massachusetts Regiment, which was composed almost exclusively of men from Essex County. Robert Hale was from Beverly, Massachusetts, but the regiment rolls that I was reviewing, it appears it is almost exclusively Essex County men. Hale's regiment saw extensive combat during the siege of Louisburg. They played a very crucial role in defeating the French. Most notably, they were responsible for establishing a artillery battery that pretty much crippled some of the French main defenses. The battery was known as Titcomb's Battery, which is named after Major Titcomb, who was the artillery commander of the expedition. The fortification they erected was located on the northwest shore of the harbor overlooking Fortress Louisburg, and they proceeded to bombard and destroy the Dauphin Gate, which is one of the major entry points of Louisburg, nearby bastions, breaking key defenses. Without those areas being eliminated, the French probably could have lasted even longer. But what is also interesting is Lieutenant Frye, as well as his fellow officers and men, also participated in several nighttime attacks against French lines, which means they're going into French batteries, and they're basically either capturing them or they're engaging in hand-to-hand combat to take these particular lines. Sadly, 16 men from Andover would lose their lives from either wounds or sickness during the Louisburg campaign. Fortunately, Lieutenant James Frye emerged from this particular campaign unscathed. He returned home, and he once again began to assume his life. But what you actually do see is in the months after the siege of Louisburg and in the years afterwards, James Frye does two things. He starts petitioning the Massachusetts colonial legislature. He says, hey, remember all the Massachusetts men who volunteered for service to take this French fortification. A lot of them lost lives, and the family should be compensated. I put my life on line. I should be compensated. And we should be compensated either financially or there's a lot of really nice tracts of land up in Maine, in York County, that we would really like to see. And so what happens is, and that happened again. This is my fault. I apologize, ladies and gentlemen. My fat fingers hit the wrong button. There we go. I'm not going to read it all, but this is the transcription of his petition to the Massachusetts colonial legislature, where he's advocating on the behalf of the families who lost men, those men who lost their lives at Louisburg. He's advocating on behalf of them, as well as the veterans of Louisburg from the Andover area, for compensation as a result of their military service. So here's a man, and this petition, I believe, is 1752. Several years after the siege of Louisburg, he is advocating on behalf of his fellow veterans to ensure that they are rightfully compensated. And here's the really neat thing. A lot of petitions during this time were denied. You know, it's like, we can't afford it, you didn't improve service or anything. But James Frye is actually able to convince Massachusetts colonial legislature to approve the requests. And as a result, when you start getting out towards York County, the northwest section of York County, out towards what is modern-day New Hampshire, they are issued tracts of land. So by the 1750s, James Frye is also holding land in Maine as well, and various townships are created. Well, what happens with James Frye after that as we get into the 1750s? Well, by the 1750s, what we're seeing here is in 1754, James is now a captain of a militia company, which means that his men from Andover voted him to be under his command. Unlike Virginia, unlike New Jersey, where militia officers are appointed by the Crown or appointed by the governor, here in Massachusetts, they are elected by their fellow men. So as a result, he is placed in command of a militia company. Now, there's roughly about 2 to 4 militia companies in Andover at this particular time. He's in charge of one of the companies, and they are all brigaded together or organized together under a regiment of militia that is known as the 4th Regiment of Foot. And that regiment is commanded by Colonel Richard Saltonstall of Haverhill. On September 12, 1754, Frye, as well as the other Andover officers, the other captains and lieutenants, appeared before Saltonstall to be sworn in as officers. Part of his instructed, he would have been responsible to carefully and diligently discharge the duty of captain in leading, ordering, and exercise said company in arms, both inferior officers and soldiers, and to keep them in good order and discipline. He's administering a legal royal oath that he's becoming a militia officer of this 4th Regiment of Foot. And as such, he would have been responsible for inspecting his men to ensure they're armed appropriately, issuing fines if they were not, issuing punishment. And he also had to make sure they were properly drilled. They had to appear at least monthly during this time in the 1750s, and ensure that his company was available for both emergencies and recruitment purposes. Now, jump forward to 1755, a year after he is appointed captain. Once again, war breaks out between England and France. And this is essentially the war to end all wars when it comes between England and France. I want you to pay close attention to these uniforms. These are living history interpreters from Fort Ticonderoga. I do want you to pay attention to the uniform, because the uniform is going to come back. It's going to be very relevant in just a second. Because there was this perception during the French and Indian War that Massachusetts soldiers went out dressed in rifle shirts and they looked like frontiersmen and coonskin caps and everything. That's not what they looked like. This is the uniform of the Massachusetts Provincial Army during the French and Indian War. They would have worn blue coats with red facing, and generally underneath it they would have worn their own personal clothing. They would have been issued a coat. So in 1755, the 7 Years' War, what is known as the French and Indian War in the North American theater, breaks out. New England actually plays a very significant role in this war. Not that they didn't play a significant role in previous wars, but they're having a bigger role. Not only are they sending troops to fight this war, but they're also providing logistical supplies to the British Army, and they're also allowing most of their harbors to be used as potential ports for the Royal Navy. And so what you see during this time is New England is basically, sorry, what is wrong with that laptop? The war basically goes on up until 1763. 1755, New England and Massachusetts and England is doing amazing. They kick the French butt at various battles. 1756 to roughly about 1758, the French are winning the war. And now there's a possible threat that, England is going to lose a lot of its holdings. Ultimately, William Pitt comes in as the British Prime Minister. He pumps a ton of money and a ton of troops into the North American theater. They turn around and they ultimately capture Quebec, leading to the surrender of the French in North America, and the war eventually resolves itself, where at that point France is basically absent from North America, with the exception of some holdings down in Louisiana and down in Florida. France has pretty much given up about 90% of its territories at that point. And of course, because of the French and Indian War, the French and Indian War expands British influence throughout North America, but it only exacerbates, as we're going to see in a few minutes, tensions between the Crown as well as the New England colonies. Well, where is now Lieutenant Colonel James Frye during these activities? Well, there was a Battle of Lake George that took place in 1755. It was between the French and Massachusetts forces and British forces. And it was a resounding victory. It was a difficult victory, but it was an overwhelming victory for the British forces. They defeated the French. And as a result, it was determined for the 1756 campaign that from Lake George, they would use Lake George in New York as a springboard to attack Fort Ticonderoga, which at that time was in the hands of the French, as well as this location known as Fort Frederick, which is also known as Crown Point in New York. So they were going to launch in 1756 these operations into key strongholds. And ladies and gentlemen, I apologize. Any chance you have a clicker?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay, that's all right.
I do have a laser pointer if you want that.
Nah, that's all right. It's my fat fingers. I keep hitting the wrong side of the laptop, and I keep doing that. Okay. Massachusetts decided to raise approximately 3,000 men for an operation against Crown Point. It was recruited in a similar method as they did with Louisburg. Officers would show up, they would meet with militia, try and recruit men for this operation. And of course, there was this big fanfare and interest to go on this operation because, hey, we kind of defeated the French in 1755. Let's kick their bahookie again in 1756 and end this war. In addition to Massachusetts troops, there were troops from Connecticut, there were troops from New York, and other provinces, and they were placed under the command of Major General John Winslow, who is a Massachusetts colonist, but he's also considered a royal officer, who had had significant experience in previous French wars. It was also the individual who had been responsible for removing the Acadians from the previous year in 1755 from Nova Scotia. Ironically, several Acadian families ended up here in Andover, both the South Parish and the North Parish, after they were evicted from Canada. The problem was this expedition was a complete disaster. What happened is they were plagued by delays. There was poor supply lines, supply shortages, there was disease. Furthermore, the British troops who were supposed to come up and support this provincial army were delayed significantly. So as a result, the British and these American forces, as well as we're going to see Colonel Frye, are just basically sitting on the shores of Lake George, waiting for an opportunity to attack Crown Point. And again, what they spent most of their time doing is actually construction of fortifications. So Lieutenant Colonel Frye during this time is overseeing with his troops the construction of various fortifications, including fortifying Fort William Henry, as well as creating fortifications on the southern end of Lake George, instead of moving on Crown Point or instead of moving on Fort Ticonderoga. Again, Massachusetts troops suffered from disease. There was multiple deaths. Morale completely declined. By the end of 1756, Lieutenant Colonel Frye and his troops in the regiment he was assigned to did not really see any action. Again, just like when he was a young militiaman, there is a possibility that he was engaged in patrolling along the New York frontier as well as engaging in construction. But the failure of the 1756 campaign just underscored how the British were not prepared for an extended war with France. And as a result, they needed William Pitt when he came in 1757 to sort of revitalize and turn things around. Now, this is not Lieutenant Colonel James Frye, but this is an unknown Massachusetts officer from the French and Indian War. As I showed you what the enlisted uniforms would have looked like, this is what an officer's uniform of the French and Indian War would have looked like. So this is what a uniform that most likely Lieutenant Colonel James Frye would have worn. And what you see here is, first of all, again, it is the blue coat with the red facing, but you notice the gold stripes on the coat? That's gold lacing, which shows his status as an officer. He's wearing probably a finer wool or a finer silk waistcoat, again, with lacing. And you can also see that the pockets and the sleeves also have lacing as well. Lieutenant Colonel James Frye would have purchased his own uniform before going off to the Crown Point expedition. He was placed as second in command of Lieutenant Colonel Ichabod Plaisted's regiment. I can always screw up his name. And the regiment, similar to his time with Hale's regiment during the Louisburg expedition, most of the regiment was made of Essex County men, but they did also recruit men from Middlesex County as well as York County, Maine. I see an inordinate number of men from the Wells area who end up in Plaisted's regiment. The regiment mustered in May of 1756, so already they're behind the game for getting out towards the war effort. And they finally marched out roughly around May 31st towards Albany from Massachusetts. Again, as I talked, they really didn't see much combat. They were mostly engaged in fortification construction, fatigue work, as well as possibly patrolling the borders. This was a regiment that only served for a year. Unlike the British Army, where you usually enlist for life, in Massachusetts provincial forces during the French and Indian War and earlier wars, you would only usually enlist for no more than a year. So these regiments dissolved at the end of the year. So by November, this regiment pretty much picked up everything, all its supplies, turned around and returned to Massachusetts at the end of the year because their terms of service had ended. I suspect this experience in Crown Point may have soured James at this particular point, because you do not see him enlist in any provincial militia, provincial regiment for the rest of the war. Instead, what you see is he returns to serving as first a militia captain, and then by 1760, he's actually serving as colonel of the 4th Essex Regiment of Foot. So he's focusing on his time within his militia service. It's also around the time of 1760 that he is elected to the Massachusetts colonial legislature and has a short stint as a representative of Andover at the colonial legislature. Well, this now brings us to the political and constitutional crisis of the 1760s and the early 1770s. And I'm going to be brief about this because I could give an entire lecture on this. Real quickly, England had a bunch of debts. The debts exceeded over 7 million pounds. England said, how are we going to pay this debt that we amassed as a result of the French-Indian War and defeating the French? I know, let's bill the people who benefited from our war effort, the colonists in the American colonies. Massachusetts led the forefront saying, you can't do this without our input. And by the way, a lot of your laws that are imposing these taxations come with these cute little hidden riders where you're going to start suppressing some of our English liberties or constitutional rights. Series of protests erupt. Andover initially responded peacefully to them. Colonel James Frye responded peacefully to them. But as you start getting towards closer to the 1768, 1769, there were riots all over Massachusetts in opposition to British Crown policy. 1773, after the Boston Massacre horrified Andover, horrified James Frye, because it's British troops firing into unarmed civilians, even though they were rioting. And what happened was, 1773, a bunch of Boston colonists dump a bunch of tea into Boston Harbor. And as a result of that, England, including this gentleman, King George III, are enraged at what happened. And as a result, they decide to make Massachusetts an example. They shut Boston Harbor. They essentially dissolve the Massachusetts colonial legislature. They replace the governor's council. And they take the Charter of 1691, which is Massachusetts' version of the United States Constitution, rip it up and say it is dissolved. So in the mindset of colonists at this particular time, in 1774, when word came down that this is happening, Massachusetts looks to Ireland, they look to India, and they say, we saw what England did to those two lands, we're next. They're going to force us into a war, they're going to strip us of all our constitutional liberties, and they are going to make us slaves. And this is the mindset you see in all the writings of this particular time. So in the mindset of James Frye, on the eve of Lexington and Concord, this is a war to preserve their way of life. This is a war to preserve their English liberties. This is a war to essentially protect their family from becoming enslaved. And so what you see is by October of 1774, Massachusetts Bay Colony, particularly the Merrimack Valley, is absolutely positively in full wartime buildup. And the wartime buildup, and again, just to touch upon this, Massachusetts forms a rebel government after the legislature is dissolved. As I always joke, in the tradition of Star Wars, Massachusetts creates the Rebel Alliance, known as the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. Right away, they issue orders saying, we're going to war with England. We need to be prepared for that war with England. And one of the first things they do is they say, who is going to fight this war for us? Well, they decide who is going to fight this war is going to be our militia companies, and we are going to create what are called Minutemen. Now, the concept of Minutemen is not something that came out of thin air. The concept of Minutemen dates back to about 1625, when Plymouth Colony created a Minuteman concept to respond in rapid response. But what happens is basically the Massachusetts Provincial Congress says two things. Number one, any loyalist officers that are within your militia company or your militia regiment, get rid of them. They got to go. Number two, once you get rid of them and you replace them with loyal patriot officers, take roughly 50 men and put them in from your militia companies. Now, militia companies varied in size. Often militia companies were roughly about 100 men. But they would say, take 50 men, up to 50 men, set them aside, and they are going to become a Minute Company. And then the Minuteman companies will be organized into a regiment. This happened here at the 4th Essex. In 1774, Colonel James Frye is not the colonel of the 4th Essex. It's Richard Saltonstall again, and he is a fierce, fierce loyalist. Militia troops from Bradford in Haverhill appeared on his front lawn in 1774 and said, "We think it's time for you to retire." He said, "No, I am not giving up my position. I refuse to give up my position." They showed up roughly 2 days later, and they brought several other companies from Salem, New Hampshire, Bradford, Andover, and Haverhill. "You want to resign now?" He quickly realized he was in a very serious situation and fled. And as a result, Colonel Samuel Johnson of Andover, Massachusetts, was voted as his replacement. Now, the neat thing real quickly about Minutemen, which I am studying right now, and the documentation I've seen, it seems to imply that your Minutemen were mostly your younger men, roughly about 18 to 24. But I'm not seeing that in every company. Many, many companies I'm seeing that, but not all of them. And that makes sense. The analogy I often give, if myself and my son lived back in 1775 and the town common was a half mile away, if there's an alarm, my son runs like 5 miles a day. He'd get there, 30 seconds, and he'd not sweat on his body at all. He'd be looking great. Go get the Brits. Me, I'm going to run a block. I got to stop for a break. I'll probably go another block. I've got to, stop at Dunks, keep going, and then maybe I'll get there in a half hour. It makes sense why they were trying to recruit younger people into their minute companies. Well, as the preparation continues, and so military preparations, the other thing that the Massachusetts Provincial Congress said after you get rid of your loyalist officers and form the Minuteman companies, they say start inspecting your arms and start drilling and start preparing for war. This is real. You can't just simply have, a militia company drill once a year. You guys need to be drilling constantly. And this is what we actually see. You have various companies that are constantly drilling, constantly fielding. We do see in the Merrimack Valley that Haverhill, Salisbury, and Bradford are the first 3 to form Minuteman companies in January by January of 1775. Andover, Boxford are a little bit slow. I'm not going to pick on Amesbury tonight because Amesbury really was on the cheap and they didn't want to create a Minuteman company because it cost too much money. But eventually they packed the town meeting and got a Minuteman company through. But regarding the towns that were a little slow, Andover, Samuel Johnson, actually the militia colonel, went to the various towns and visited them in late January or early February to convince them to form Minuteman companies. And what happens is you see in January of 1775 in this town, the 2 militia companies of the North Parish assemble, and then Colonel Johnson gives a speech. I've got the transcript somewhere. I've got to find it. I promised David I would find it, and I still haven't found it. But he gives us a patriotic speech about defending English liberties, and then 50 men from the North Parish rush forward, and they form a Minuteman company under Thomas Poor from the North Parish. That same day, Colonel Johnson goes and visits Andover, the South Parish, and gives the same speech. And they form a Minuteman company as well under Benjamin Ames. And of course, here is the transcription of the. You guys got to give me like a shock collar or something so that anytime I do this, it will keep. Here is the transcription, and it talks about it. And again, I will share the slide with everyone. But where does Colonel James Frye fall into this equation? Here's the interesting thing. The way Minuteman and militia companies worked was just as I described before. The men of the militia and minute company will vote in their officers. So the men of a company would vote for their captains and vote for their lieutenants and vote for their ensigns and vote for their sergeants and corporals. It was all by democratic process. In turn, all the officers of the various companies would get together and vote for the colonel and vote for the lieutenant colonel, vote for the major, vote for the adjutant. And the man they chose to lead their Minuteman battalion was not some 25-year-old guy. They looked to a person that they looked for leadership experience. They want for somebody who has military experience, who is going to inspire them on the field. Somebody who is going to step forward and say, if we're going to fight, I've got your back. They chose James Frye of Andover, the North Parish. So your James Frye was chosen by Andover, Methuen, Bradford, Amesbury, Haverhill, Boxford to lead every Minuteman company within that region of the Merrimack Valley. And you see other individuals chosen as well. James Brickett of Haverhill was lieutenant colonel. It appears James Brickett was very close to James Frye. Benjamin Foster was quartermaster. Thomas Kittredge, another famous name we've heard, as surgeon. Daniel Hardy of Bradford as adjutant. Immediately, James Frye jumps into action and says, we are going to start preparing for war. And what you see is you start seeing these various towns starting under James Frye's instructions to start getting arms and equipment for their Minutemen. He's sending instructions to his various companies, and at the same time, the towns are acting upon it. And what you see is, the question is, where did this militiaman get all his wonderful equipment? The belief is that, he got it off a dead British soldier from the French and Indian War. Or he brought something back from France, from the French and Indian War from a dead French soldier. Or a British deserter in Boston in 1774 gave it to him. The reality is that's a small percentage. What you actually see here in the Merrimack Valley and throughout Massachusetts, but particularly in the Merrimack Valley, is you see the various towns, because James Frye is saying, I want my Minuteman Company ready. I want my Minuteman Company to, if we got to go into battle, I want them fully armed and equipped. And what you see is you see the towns going to various skilled tradespeople within their community to make equipment for Frye's Minutemen. If there's a saddler who specializes in leather, they're making cartridge boxes like this original cartridge box here in this image, or they're making belting for bayonets. Other people are making knapsacks. Other people are modifying muskets so that bayonets can be slipped onto the gun. Other people are acquiring blankets. Some people are going to Salem to buy lead bricks, bring them back and melting them down. So you see this common theme that's taking place throughout Andover and throughout the Merrimack Valley under Colonel Frye's, encouragement to take place. Well, one of the real big things that Andover wants for their Minutemen are bayonets. They want to make sure that they have the same weapon that the British have when they go on the field. Bayonet is a steel blade. It's about a foot long, maybe a little bit longer, that slides over the barrel. When it gets to hand-to-hand combat, you are going to rely upon that bayonet, because what happens is when you fix the bayonet to your musket, it becomes a spear. Andover is doing everything in their power. They're passing town resolutions saying, we need to get bayonets for our Minute Company. They're telling residents, if you have a bayonet, we'll buy it from you. If you have a relative you haven't given the bayonet, he's a Minuteman, but you still have it, we'll buy it from you. If we still don't have enough, we're going to go out and try and acquire it. You also see, there's also this belief that Minutemen just simply grabbed their guns, ran to the battle. No drill, no training. If you ever watched the movie, which actually got me into Lexington and Concord, it's called April Morning. It's a Hallmark movie from 1985. I like it, but it's horrible. That's the best thing I can say. My wife doesn't let me watch it anymore because I sit there yelling at the screen all the time. There's a line in the movie where I think it's Rip Torn or somebody says, we're not trained, but we're going to chase them all the way back to Boston, and every man for himself. That's not what happened. What you actually see is James Frye is drilling his men very, very hard. Whether they're in Haverhill, Bradford, Boxford, or Andover, they are constantly drilling. And we see here, because James Frye is saying we're going to drill, you see the town of Andover passes a resolution saying that we want our Minutemen to appear on the field, well armed and equipped, proficient with arms and equipment, proficient with drill, because the Minutemen and the militiamen of Massachusetts, especially the Merrimack Valley, were drilling and using the same exact military drill manual as the British Army. They had adopted the same drill manual as the British Army. And Andover goes even far as to say, long story short, we got to hire a guy who's going to teach us how to drill, because we want to make sure that we're proper on the field. We even see that the person that they hire, okay, I started seeing him in various different records in Haverhill, Bradford, up in Maine, believe it or not, up in Wells he appeared a couple of times, a guy named George Marsden. And I always visioned that who the heck is George Marsden? I visioned that he was this grizzled French and Indian War ranger who was like 80 years old, who just yelled at everybody. He's got all the 18 to 25-year-old Minutemen, and like back in my day when I fought the French, this is how we did it. And I used to say that during my lectures until I gave a lecture and Don Hagest, who's considered an expert on the 18th century British Army, pulled me aside after the lecture. He was kind enough to do that. He said, Alex, you're wrong about George Marsden. George Marsden is not who you think it is. So I'm going to leave you with a teaser. We're going to come back to him in 30 seconds. But here's a key thing I want you to keep in mind, how serious James Frye was with his battalion. April 13th, 1775, the Minuteman companies from Haverhill, Bradford, and Andover, roughly about 150 men, minimum, more likely 200, assemble in Andover to have a battalion-level drill under Frye's instruction. And according to documentation from Captain Sawyer and his Haverhill Minute Company, they had a drill in Andover during this time, and they were actually engaging in military maneuvers, practicing firing, and also engaging in skirmishing tactics. And two important people were there. The first one was James Frye, because it's colonel, it's his battalion, he's going to make sure they're drilling. And secondly was this gentleman that kept popping up, George Marsden. And so I kept asking, who the heck was George Marsden? Well, Don Hagest finally said, Alex, George Marsden was not a colonist. George Marsden was a British deserter. So what you had was George Marsden had deserted from the 59th Regiment of Foot. He was a sergeant at the time. He had had enough, and basically what he did was roughly about 1774, he fled from Boston and went into the countryside, eventually settling in Haverhill, Massachusetts. When war starts to break out, or the threat of war starts to break out, George Marsden is essentially an economic opportunist. And what he does is he starts offering his services to drill the militia and Frye's Minute Company the same way that the British drilled. So you basically have from roughly about November of 1774 all the way up to April of 1775, George Marsden, British deserter, Haverhill, Massachusetts resident, is drilling Frye's Minutemen. They are one of only 2 minute battalions that I can document in New England that are actually being drilled by a British deserter. Pretty wild. And the reason I picked that particular reenactor, that is what a soldier from the 59th Regiment of Foot would have looked like, even with the ugly purple. So keep this in mind that Frye's regiment is British trained, and that's going to come into play at Bunker Hill. Well, when we get to April 9th, we're coming towards the tail end here of Colonel Frye's legacy. And over the next remaining about 15 minutes or so, I just want to talk about the military actions of Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. I apologize, I'm going to assume, again, I could give an entire 2-hour worth lecture on Bunker Hill and Lexington and Concord, but real short and simple. Fight happens at Lexington. British are marching to Concord to seize his ammunition. There's a fight at Lexington. As a result, word starts to spread that the British are advancing towards Concord. More word starts to spread saying, hey, a bunch of people were slaughtered at Lexington. Minuteman companies and militia companies all over eastern Massachusetts mobilize, including Andover. It appears that the 2-minute companies from Andover, Ames's company from the South Parish and Poor's company here in North Andover, mobilized roughly between 7 and 10 in the morning once they got word from a Timothy Herrick, who was an alarm writer. That's how I grew up on Herrick Road in North Andover. I always wanted to know who Herrick was. He was an alarm writer who came up through Tewksbury to Andover to spread the word that the British were mobilizing on Concord. The interesting thing about the Andover companies did not see action. They essentially marched from their various commons, went down into Tewksbury, went into Billerica, went into Bedford. And this is where it gets kind of a little confusion. They kept getting confusing information where the British were. They told them that, hey, they're in Concord right now. They changed direction, started marching towards Concord. As they're marching through Bedford, somebody said, nope, they're on their way back towards Lexington. You got to turn around. They changed direction again. Someone came along again, said, nope, they're still in Concord. Turn. They turned direction again. So they're going back and forth, back and forth. And there's a reason why they missed the British, which we'll talk about. But I estimate that they were roughly probably about 2 to 4 hours behind the fighting, where they were located during the fight. But when the Andover Minutemen with Frye came into Lexington, they are seeing the aftermath of the fighting from the morning in the aftermath of the fighting as the British are retreating back through there. And they are horrified. If anyone knows this jerk, let me know. He's really a handsome guy. Did I get it right, Bob? Okay, thanks. This is an account of Lieutenant Benjamin Farnham, who's from the South Parish, where he talks about how his Minuteman company is constantly shifting direction, trying to catch up with the British, going back and forth, back and forth. They, again, mentions they weren't unable to catch up to him. You see an original account here that's written out in a journal that's currently in the Massachusetts Historical Society, that's of Thomas Boynton. Same thing. He talks about how they're constantly chasing the enemy, how they shift directions left and right, and how eventually they end up in Charlestown, just outside of Charlestown in Cambridge for the evening, and how they see the destruction that takes place as passing through. But it's really the one that stands out is the account of James Stephens, another famous guy from North Andover. James Stephens was from this town, North Andover, and he talks about how they entered, first they're going back and forth in different directions, and when they came into Lexington, they saw the Meeting House. Now, Meeting House is the 18th century equivalent of a government building, military storehouse, but it's also a church. You didn't have churches like as you see today. Meeting House is where you would hold religious services, and they're seeing artillery hits through the Meeting House. They're talking about how he went through Lexington and saw several dead regulars on the road, and some of our own men, and 3 or 4 houses were burnt. Cattle and hog were killed. British plundered every house, broke furniture, broke down doors. They saw slaughter when they were coming through Notomy, which is the brutal, vicious fight of April 19th. That is the 18th century equivalent of Black Hawk Down, where British and American soldiers are literally in hand-to-hand fighting in every house. And he's absolutely horrified what he sees. Well, the question often becomes, if you ever read my blog, why did Andover miss the British? Because there was an opportunity they could have intercepted. They were engaged in a forced march. They were rapidly running as they're going down, to try and intercept. But something happened in Billerica that caused them to lose time, that they weren't able to catch up once they were in Billerica. And the reason is, as I discussed in my blog several times, Andover stopped for lunch. They went to Tewksbury and then to Billerica. We stopped at Pollard's, which was a tavern in Billerica, to eat some biscuit and cheese. Beautiful meal. But because of that, according to Private James Stephens, they weren't able to catch up with the British at that time. Well, now we get to the Siege of Boston. And this is where it gets a little wonky, because the Siege of Boston, after Lexington and Concord, they are now surrounded by roughly 20,000 Massachusetts Minutemen and militiamen all around Boston, which Frye and his Minutemen are part of that. Well, the Minutemen and the militiamen are only a temporary army. They've got commitments back home that they constantly have to look for. So as a result, Massachusetts, you have soldiers who are coming and going and deserting because they want to go back to their farms. They weren't expecting to stay outside of a siege for more than a day or two. So you start seeing a lot of them return. Now, originally, Frye's battalion encamped on April 19th and April 20th in Cambridge, although some elements of most likely the Amesbury and Haverhill elements camped in Menotomy that night. But the next day, on April 20th, they formed up on the Cambridge Common as part of the Massachusetts Grand Army, the army that is besieging the British. And for the next few weeks, Frye's battalion was reorganized from a Minuteman battalion into a regiment that is part of the Massachusetts Grand Army. What you saw in a nutshell was they took some of the Minuteman companies, they merged them into companies together. They dissolved certain companies and went back to Amesbury, for example, and recruited new men, brought them in. So you see throughout the late April, early May, Frye's regiment goes through this sort of change from a Minuteman battalion to a true infantry regiment. And so what happened is by May of 1775, Frye is in command of over 500 men from the Merrimack Valley, and they agreed to serve for the remainder of the year, which makes sense because New England is used to year-long service based upon what they did when fighting the French. So they agree to serve for a full year. And the regiment was assigned to Prospect Hill, which I visited today, which is located then in Cambridge. It's now in Somerville. Prospect Hill was nicknamed the Citadel of the American Lines. It is the strongest position on the American siege lines around that Half Moon fortification. It's the highest point, has the highest number of fortifications. This particular document is actually an officer's commission of Lieutenant Colonel James Brickett of Haverhill. Lieutenant Colonel Brickett stayed on as Frye's second in command, again, showing that these two had some sort of a friendly relationship going on. Well, what you see is the next time Frye actually sees combat is between May 27th and May 28th of 1775, an event that is called the Battle of Noodles Island, or also the Battle of Chelsea Creek. It's really an unknown battle. Not many people know about it because you had Bunker Hill on one end and you have Lexington and Concord on the other. This is essentially a battle over foraging, where the British are attempting to go out into harbor islands to get forage to feed their troops and the civilian population trapped in Boston, and the Americans are trying to interdict and prevent that from actually happening. The battle was a combat between provincial militia, primarily from New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, against both British infantry and Royal Navy. Colonel John Stark's New Hampshire men, you had Colonel John Nixon's regiment, led the raid. They were supplemented by a 16-man detachment under the command of Thomas Poor from Andover. They joined in the expedition and served next to these New Hampshire and Massachusetts men. Well, later in the engagement, as this firefight starts to erupt into this massive battle of Chelsea Creek, General Israel Putnam arrives with Connecticut troops, and who's there to back him up but Colonel Frye's entire regiment? And Frye brings artillery pieces with him as well. So as a result, this fight turns into this massive battle that is taking place. And what it is they're fighting on the shoreline, basically the mainland. They're fighting on Noodles Island. They're fighting along Chelsea Creek. And then the Royal Navy gets involved, and they send up a ship called the HMS Diana, where they're attempting to basically fire grape shot into the American forces to sweep them from the field. But the Diana runs aground. And next thing you know, Frye and Stark and the various regiments are now directing their fire at the Diana, and they're firing artillery at the Diana as well. Long story short, the Diana had to be abandoned, which is a massive embarrassment for the Royal Navy. Admiral Graves, who's in command of the Royal Navy outside of Boston, is furious that he lost the ship. The Americans are able to go on board the ship, steal all the military supplies, and then burn the vessels to the ground. So it went right down to the shoreline. Americans only suffered 3 wounded in this firefight that took place over 2 days. British losses were roughly 2 dead, but there is a belief by historians that the British sort of buried the actual casualties. But it was a very embarrassing moment for the British. It denied access to necessary foraging supplies, but it did represent the first time 2 things. First of all, it was the first time units from multiple colonies worked together in conjunction, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. And it was also the first occasion that artillery was used by American forces during the American Revolution. And now that brings us to our final part, the Battle of Bunker Hill. Again, I will give a nutshell of the battle. You have 2 hills overlooking Boston during the Siege of Boston. Bunker's Hill, Dorchester Heights. Some point in June, General Thomas Gage, who's the commander of the British forces in Boston, looks up at the 2 hills and says, "Oh crap, those 2 hills are currently unoccupied. If the Americans occupy either one or both, we are going to have to evacuate Boston. We cannot hold Boston because those 2 hills, you can put artillery up on those hills and just pound Boston to the dirt." And what happens is he comes up with a plan that he's going to seize both hills. It was going to be this very complex operation where certain troops would do an amphibious landing and land in Charlestown and rush up and take Bunker's Hill, while at the same time there was going to be land troops. They were going to punch out through Roxbury, advance up and take Dorchester Heights, which is located today in South Boston. The problem was, there's a lot of problems in all military operations. Somebody had loose lips. And as a result, what happened is with the loose lips, somebody found out and gave the Americans information that this is what the British were doing. So as a result, General Ward, who is the commander of the American forces, dispatches troops to the Bunker's Hill, Eventually, they moved down onto Breed's Hill and began a fortification. British wake up the next morning and go, where the heck did that come from? Which leads to the Battle of Bunker Hill. The one thing I would start, before we get into James Frye's role at the Battle of Bunker Hill, I do want to stress, as I said at the beginning of my lecture, the Battle of Bunker Hill was a Merrimack Valley fight. It was actually Merrimack Valley and Rockingham County fight. Okay? The regiments inside the redoubt, the first one was Colonel William Prescott's regiment, which was composed of men mostly from the Middlesex County portion of the Merrimack Valley, including Chelmsford, Dunstable, and Westford. You then had Colonel Ebenezer Bridges' regiment, which was a composite regiment. It had men from, for example, Tewksbury and Billerica, but he also had men from Andover. But his men were predominantly from Merrimack Valley. And then finally, you have Colonel James Frye's regiment, which was composed of men from Andover all the way up to Salisbury that were inside that redoubt. Well, as the Battle of Bunker Hill is raging, it's a nasty, ugly fight. The American Revolution is a nasty, ugly fight. It got watered down in the 19th century in the aftermath of the American Civil War because people didn't want to read about the bloodshed and the gore after experiencing the Civil War. So as a result, a lot of times Bunker Hill gets sort of washed away with the brutality. This is a massive firefight where the British suffered 50%, almost 50% casualties at the end of the day. This is how brutal this fight is. And even though the Americans are doing quite well, they're in a really, really ugly situation. They are running out of ammunition, they are running out of supplies, and their morale is starting to crater. We have an account. I had to make a reference to Newburyport. A soldier from Little's regiment. Little's regiment was not in the redoubt. They were along the rail fence. And they talk about how, basically they're thirsty. They're looking for booze. The British are coming up to, attack them, line after line after line. And they are firmly convinced nobody is coming to help us. We are all going to die on this hill, and this is it. And so as a result, the lines start to collapse. Men start fleeing. And during the first attack, which was repulsed, now before I go on, Colonel James Frye is not here right now at the moment. During the Battle of Bunker Hill as it began, he is back at a court-martial. He is like the general officer in charge of a court-martial. So his regiment is in command of his Haverhill buddy, Lieutenant Colonel Brickett. Well, during the first wave of the British attack, Lieutenant Brickett is wounded, and he's carried off the field. Now at this particular point, Frye's regiment is leaderless. Meanwhile, back at home, Andover residents are climbing Holt Hill, which is near Merrimack College, and they are looking towards Boston, because if you ever go up on Holt Hill, you have a clear view of Boston. They're watching the battle from Andover, knowing it's a really ugly fight. They can see Charlestown burning. They can hear the artillery blasting, and they're completely unaware that their loved ones are in the middle of this particular fight. So you have loved ones at home who are absolutely horrified at what's happening. Frye's battalion is without a leader right now, and many of the men inside the redoubt are starting to flee. The American line is starting to collapse. And this is where I'm like, wow, this is where you should be making movies, okay? Because this is something you would think that you saw it in The Patriot with Mel Gibson running forward. But this is what James Frye actually did. James Frye somehow learns about what is going on with the battle taking place up on Bunker's Hill in the middle of his court-martial. James Frye stands up, dismisses the court-martial, gets on his horse, and starts riding towards the battlefield. He gets to Charlestown Neck, which is a narrow strip of land that leads out to where the battlefield is. And he's absolutely horrified at what he sees. He sees American troops on the Cambridge side of Charlestown Neck, cowering, refusing to cross the neck. He looks across on the other side of the neck, and he sees that Americans are fleeing the battlefield. And then he sees further on, he sees that the British are getting ready for another assault. He has a choice at this particular point. He can then shore up the defensive lines in the Cambridge side so he can receive the troops as they're coming back, or he could go across the neck. He decides to go across the neck. Well, what happens is, as he spurs his horse across the neck, the Royal Navy is firing grape shot and artillery at the neck for anyone trying to get across. So he's coming across. The grape shot is golf ball-sized iron balls. They have one purpose: take out troops. He's coming under direct fire as he's crossing the neck and doesn't get touched at all. He comes riding up to his troops, and he's completely unscathed. He comes riding up to his troops, and according to a period account, which I was able to trace the transcription. I'm trying to find the original document. It is an account of a Continental soldier from January 13th, 1776. James Frye wheels his horse into the redoubt in front of his men, draws his sword, and then basically shouts to him, "I was with you at the Battle of Louisburg. We Americans can win this fight again. Remember Louisburg, remember Louisburg." Minutes later, because he's an obvious target, he's hit with a musket ball in the thigh. Now, at this particular point, you'd think, okay, well, he gave a great inspirational speech. Let's carry him off the field. He's wounded. Frye refuses to leave. So now his troops are saying, oh my God, our colonel is here with us. He's going to be with us, and he's refusing to leave the battlefield. And he didn't leave the battlefield. This guy gets down off his horse and starts going up onto the redoubt and insulting the British because they didn't kill him. Okay? He's hurling insults at them. And again, this is from the January 13th, 1776 letter, Sergeant George Hathaway. Frye remains with his men for the entire remainder of the fight. And during the third and final assault, Frye's regiment is engaged in a vicious rear guard action. They are putting their lives on the line under the command of Colonel James Frye so that other Americans can escape off that neck. And as a result, because of James Frye's actions, as well as others, but tonight is about James Frye. James Frye saved the American Army. Okay? That is the importance that we have. And of course, when we look at the casualties that the Frye's regiment sustained, you have roughly 220, I got to stand this way so I can see it, I apologize. You have roughly, British casualties were 1,054 men. A little over 2,000 men fought for the British in that battle. Almost 50% casualty rates. By comparison, American casualties were 441, of which 140 were killed, 271 were wounded, and 30 were captured. When you look at the men of the Merrimack Valley, well, first of all, Prescott's regiment, 42 were killed, 28 were wounded. Bridges' regiment inside the redoubt, so we're just looking at the regiments inside the redoubt. 15 were killed, 29 were wounded. Frye's regiment, 15 were killed, 31 were wounded. Andover itself, 5 killed, 11 wounded. And this is why in my previous lecture, I have always said when I talk in the Merrimack Valley, but particularly in Andover, Bunker Hill is Andover's Lexington and Concord. Okay? This is the 16 casualties from Andover at the Battle of Bunker Hill. 35% of the casualties in Frye's regiment were from Andover. And it should be known, of all the American regiments that fought that day, Frye's regiment had the third highest casualty rate for the day. After General Washington, now we talk about what happened after the Battle of Bunker Hill and the final thoughts here. After the Battle of Bunker Hill, Colonel James Frye was given command of a brigade. He commanded the Citadel. He commanded a brigade at the Citadel on Prospect Hill. Why I did that? In August of 1775, Washington reorganized the Continental Army around Boston and gave them new unit designations. Colonel Frye and his men were given the honor of being the 1st Regiment of Foot, which means they were the ranking senior regiment of the entire Continental Army for 1775, under the command of Colonel James Frye. Frye's regiment was officially disbanded on December 31st, 1775, following the Continental Congress reorganizing the Continental Army for 1776. At the final months of 1775, James Frye started to suffer from his wound at Bunker Hill. Disease and infection had settled in. He sustained at Bunker Hill, and as a result, he returned to Andover. And sadly, despite doctors' best efforts to save him, Colonel Frye died on January 8th, 1776, where he's buried in the Old North Parish burial ground. And of course, here is his grave, which is located in the burial ground, which recognizes his service in supporting the independence of the United States. So why is it important, is my final thoughts today before I talk, and I know I've talked for a while. Why is it important to talk about the importance of James Frye and why he should be recognized? Number one, James Frye is essentially a distinguished patriot through his commitment to the American cause, sustained the American Revolution, including at the Bunker Hill. He is, as I said, he is responsible partly for saving the American army at that day, and he embodies the courage and commitment of the strive to secure America's independence. Secondly, it should be known that Colonel Frye is one of the individuals who has been recognized by the city of Boston, along with the men of his regiment in 1889, that is located in Charlestown, Massachusetts, at the base of Bunker Hill, about 2 blocks down, where they recognize his patriotism and sacrifice. And finally, Colonel Frye, believe it or not, is recognized as one of the original officers of the Society of the Cincinnati, which is the nation's oldest patriotic organization dedicated to preserving the legacy of the Continental Army, its officers, and the ideals of the American independence. So I would say Colonel Frye's role in this is he's not just a guy from Andover. He's a guy who literally gave everything to preserve his way of life here in the Andovers, and more importantly, to preserve the American cause. As he stated, as the British were coming up on that second attack, we Americans can still win this fight, and I believe that's a motto that we can still apply today. So with that, I want to thank everyone for listening to me babble on. But that is Colonel James Frye, and I will take any questions you may have.
Turn the house lights on.
Sure, turn them on. Ooh.
I'm gonna grab the question, Mike. So
Yes, sir.
I'm going to pass this mic around. If you wouldn't mind, when I hand it to you, please speak directly into it as I am. This is more for the recording than it is for everybody else in the theater. But if you speak well into it, then everybody in the theater can also hear your question.
Well, he lived in North Andover, but he was considering land in York County, Maine. How would he get there, and how long would it take him?
If you say if he was up in Maine?
Yeah, well, you said he was considering
Yeah,
purchasing property in York County.
Well, it depends on how quickly you want to travel. It's funny, my house that I own was built in 1735 in what is now Merrimack, Massachusetts. It was then part of Amesbury. The gentleman who built my house eventually moved up to just what is called Worden, New Hampshire. And he would travel often back and forth. Usually I would say if he was up in York for the tracts of land you're going, it's going to take him a couple of weeks to get up there. Okay? You're going to have to clear the land. You're going to have to set up some pathway to get up there. Eventually, what the Massachusetts legislature said was, we're going to give you that land, but you have to set up townships, and you have to make sure the veterans, particularly those families that lost lives at Lewisburg, their first priority. So he did oversee that.
Well, I wasn't thinking so much of the work on the land. I was just thinking of getting there. I mean, he didn't jump in his car and drive up there in an hour.
Yeah, there's definitely during this time, there's a lot of land speculation towards Maine. There's a lot of people who are interested even further north of Maine. Usually what you would see is from about Portland down is settled during this time. You start getting up to Booth Bay and up to Acadia and all that area, that's all prime real estate. And it's not just James Frye, his cousin Joseph Frye settled Freiburg. And so there's definitely this interest to get up into the Maine province's potential territory. Just like there's an interest to get up into New Hampshire and get up into the Hampshire Grants.
Would he get on a horse then?
Oh yeah, they would have had horses. He would have had horses. He would have had carts. Some people would have walked.
Thank you.
Follow up on that. Is it on? To follow up on that, he had 10 children. Maybe he needed the land for his sons to
I'm
have
sorry,
their own farms.
Could you repeat that? I'm putting my hearing aids in because I'm hard of hearing.
Okay. Well, if he had 10 children, they couldn't all inherit his
Right.
farm in Andover, so he needed to provide for his children land, farming, whatever.
Correct, because and again, Fred Anderson gets into this in his book, A People's Army. What he says is, what is then settled and established in New England, they're running on a land. You know, if you have two sons and you have 100 acres, those two sons are only going to get 50 acres, so they got smaller lands. So there's this desire to either acquire more land for future inheritance, or the son is going to say, oh, Dad, you secured this land up there? I'll buy it from you, and then I'm going to go up there and settle it. So that's some of the motivation as well.
While I was sitting back there, I heard someone ask the question when you mentioned the movie is April Morning.
Yes.
So the movie is April Morning. I watched it after Alex mentioned it the first time, and I think you can watch it on YouTube.
You can. You can watch it on YouTube. That's all I'm going to say.
What effort is being made to preserve the house there? I've heard a little bit about it from my buddy Jim Weefers here. But
What effort is the town? What?
Okay. The house apparently might be torn down by the new owner or developer or somebody. What effort is being made? Is there any effort being made?
I think I can take that one, Alex.
Yeah, I wasn't prepared to answer that one.
Keeping it very, very high level. We've had some really, really great conversations with the owner of the property. Oh, I put that there. And we may be in a position where we are simply looking for somebody to help us raise the money, or to raise the money, or a private owner to purchase the property. So we're kind of optimistic that we'll be able to do something to save the house without going into any details. But we've had some great conversations with the owner of the house. Thank you.
Yes. And I should apologize. It was years of listening to heavy metal that destroyed my hearing.
The number of men seems very large. How big was the population from which they were drawing these recruits?
It varied by town. Okay, you had certain towns. For example, Newburyport was roughly between 4,000 and 6,000 people on the eve of the American Revolution. Andover was roughly about 2,000. Amesbury was roughly about 2,000. Town of Lexington, if you want to look at the Middlesex County, only had roughly about 700 people in the town. So, but keep in mind, one of the impacts, which is a whole different discussion, most of the adult age men who are employable, either as farmers or skilled trades, they're all going down. They've definitely mobilized on April 19th, and we're gone, leaving only like reserve elderly forces to stay behind, or the young boys to protect the town. So Frye's regiment, from Andover all the way up to Salisbury, he had roughly about 550 men in his minute battalion. Okay, that does not include the militiamen that were drawn from that. Samuel Johnson, his numbers estimate they're much larger. He's about 800 or 900 in his full regiment. Okay, so you're looking roughly about, for combat purposes, almost 2,000 men just within the Essex County area. And again, there's some people who are exempted, there's some people who chose to stay behind, and eventually this is where you get the Continental System, where they say we can't sustain putting all our entire militia forces down in the siege of Boston and maintain Andover. We have to draw men into regiments, so they maintain the siege while we go back and maintain the farm. And of course it caused an economic depression, which is a whole other talk. Questions? No? Oh.
Coming over for you.
Hi. My question is, where was the foundry if he ran a foundry?
I am trying to locate that. It seems to be hinting that it may have been out towards what is now North Andover-Bradford line. So somewhere out in that area. I've seen some references to it, but I haven't dug as deep as I will defer to North Andover Historical Society if they know.
No, I don't off the top of my head.
Okay. If anybody finds it on their property, let me know, because I'm sure there's like gold and treasures and other stuff there. No other questions? Okay. All right, last thing I will just say, if you ever need to reach me, this is where you can reach me. That is my email address and my website. There's a whole bunch of stuff on my website. It's all free. I've got presentations. I've got research articles. You can listen to my podcast. You can look at my blog. Help yourself. That's my email address. I will make sure the Historical Society gets a copy of the presentation. But if you want to email me directly for a copy of the presentation, I'll be more than happy to. But other than that, thank you very much.